Vanakkam. Hello friends. In the previous episodes, we have been seeing the history of few of the last 7 great patrons, the Kadayelu Vallalgal, such as Kari, Ori, Adiyaman, and of course the history of Nannan, who was not one of the great 7. In this episode, we will see the history of the most prominent of these 7 chieftains, the legendary Vel Pari. His fame has been passed down through generation after generation for over nearly 2000 years. Sundarar, the Saivite saint and hymnist, sings in the beautiful Tiruppugalur Tiruppadigam that begins Tammaye pugalந்து ichai pesinum. In the second stanza, he sings, Midikkiladane, Veemane, Viral Vijayane, Villukku Ivan Endru, Kodukkiladane, Pariye Endru, Koorinum Kodupar illai. Just because you praise him that he is as strong as Bhima or as skilled as the archer Arjuna, a man would be no better. Just because you praise a man that he is as generous as Pari, he will not give you anything. Therefore, pray to him who will give you what you need, that is salvation. Podigol meniyam punniyan pugalurai paadumin pulavirgal. Nambi Aruran alias Sundarar came in the 8th century Common Era, almost 600 years after the time of Vel Pari. By that time, this Velir king had become a legend. People kept the memory of these Kadayelu Vallalgal alive by passing them down through generations, and imagine this at a time when there were no means of mass communication among the people. Pari's fame and popularity led to a lot of works being composed on him through time. But what many of these later works did was create legends around him that had no historicity. So in this episode, we will explore the history of Vel Pari with the aid of references given in the Sangam literary works. We will also see how even epigraphic evidence becomes unreliable as later rulers simply recorded hearsay and legends in inscription. Early history of the Tamil kingdom shows how by the 2nd century Common Era, the 3 great sovereigns, the Cheras, the Cholas and the Pandyas, were expanding their kingdom ruthlessly. Now the Velir chieftains had already been pushed to the hilly terrains, and the fertile river valleys were completely under the sway of the great 3. The Moovendar now went about eliminating these chieftains either by defeating and killing them in war or by subjugating them and annexing their territories to their own kingdoms. We saw how Ori, Kari and Adiyaman fell. Pari was their contemporary and ruled in the second half of the 2nd century Common Era over the Parambu Nadu. Said to have consisted of more than 300 villages, Parambu Nadu is today identified with Piranmalai in the Sivagangai district. In the Sangam landscape, it fell within the boundaries of Midalai Kootram and Mutturu Kootram, Kootram simply meaning a division of land, a territory. In his work on Agananoru, published in 2021, the Tamil scholar Professor Solomon Papaya shows how Pari's Parambu Nadu included some of the dry regions of Ramnad, Paramakudi, and shows how Parambakudi, where the term Kudi meant clan, eventually became Paramakudi. Mutturu Kootram lay on the banks of Pambaru, while Midalai Kootram was bounded by the river Vellaru in the north. Vellaru also formed the southern boundary of the Chola Empire. Pambaru in the south and by the oceans in the west, that is today's Bay of Bengal. Now these territories were under the rule of another famed chieftain, Vel Pari, about whom we have seen in previous episodes. Pari was a descendant of the lineage of Vel Pari. Iyalther annal evvi tolkudi padiyar mattu ivar kaivan Pari. Kapilar records in a Purananuru poem of how Pari came from the lineage of the ancient clan of Vel Pari. The very term Tolmudir Tol meaning ancient and Mudir meaning old, goes to show that this clan should have ruled these regions for centuries together. Volume 25 of the Epigraphica Indica also records how Vel should have been an immediate ancestor of Vel Pari. It details the geographical territories covered by Mutturu Kutram and Midalai Kutram, and to the south of these regions lay the Pandya kingdom. Mangudi Kirar in a Purananuru poem 24 records of how Vel was defeated by Pandyan Nedunchezhiyan of the Battle of Thalayalanganam fame. Now, we have seen about him in detail in a separate episode, and I will give the link here. Mangudi Kirar sings, Munnir undu munnir payum, Tanga urayul nallur keliya, Omba ihe mavel evvi, Punalam Pudavin Midalayodu. You have seized Midalai with sluices where water flows, which was ruled by the great Vel who was known for his generosity. And here Munni denotes the sea, and it is by this reference that we know that Midalai Kutram was bordered on the west by the Bay of Bengal. And Mangudi Kirar continues, Ponnani Yane Tolmudir Vedir, Kuppei Nellin Mutturu Tanda, Kotta Neelkodi Kodider Chediya. You have captured his territory of Mutturu, wherein lived an ancient Velir clan whose elephants don gold ornaments. Verevi was killed in the Battle of Thalayalanganam by one Ahudai, who was a commander of Pandyan Nedunchezhiyan's army. After the death of Vel Pari took possession of the high mountains of Parambu and the surrounding regions that lay on the fringes of these Kutrams. He declared himself an independent ruler, acknowledging the authority of none of the three great kings, points out V. Kanagasabai Pillai in his The Tamils 1800 years ago. Pari was the beloved patron of bards, and Kanagasabai Pillai writes, and I quote, every wandering minstrel was welcome in Pari's mansion. They found in him a union of all those virtues which they loved to praise in their rhapsodies: reckless courage, lavish liberality, and gaiety with no reserve. He became their idol, and his fame spread throughout Tamilagam. The bards recounted in glowing language in the courts of the Chera, Chola and Pandya kings the princely hospitality with which they were entertained by Pari. This invited the jealousy of the three kings. Close quote. The famed poet Kapilar has eulogized Pari in several Puram poems. He is considered a close confidant of Pari. Now, we saw in a previous episode on Malayman Tirumudikari of how Kapilar had sung 4 Puram poems in his praise. Kapilar has also rendered poems in praise of the Chera king Selvakadungo Ariyadan. Kapilar has also written the 7th canto of the Paditruppattu in praise of this king. So, we understand that Kapilar was under the patronage of the Chera ruler and somewhere along the line switched his allegiance to Pari. In his book Vel Pari, the Sahitya Academy Award winning writer su.venkatesan presents a very interesting conjuncture. Of course, it is a work of fiction, and here su.venkatesan writes of how Kapilar came all the way to the Parambu mountain to see for himself if there was truth to the praises heaped on Pari by the bards who were wandering the lands, thereby inviting the envy of the Movendar. Once he came, Pari would not allow Kapilar to leave, as having someone of the stature of Kapilar in his court would elevate his status as well. Kapilar has rendered 17 beautiful poems on Vel Pari and his Parambu Nadu. In Purananuru 107, he sings, Pari Pari Endru Pala Ethi, Oruvar Puhalvar Senna Pulavar, Pari Oruvanum Allan, Mariyum Mundu Indu Ulagu Purappaduve. Pari Pari they utter, the poets with their eloquent tongues. There is not just Pari who gives, there is also the rain that gives and protects this world. So here, Pari's generosity is compared to that of the rains that give prosperity without prejudice to the world. Pari's Parambu Nadu was bounded by the Chola, Chera and Pandya kingdoms on all three sides, that the great three coveted his land is recorded very clearly in the Sangam poems. But to answer the question as to why the great three coveted his lands, well, they could not have seen him as a threat, as the military might of the Moovendar far surpassed that of Vel Pari, nor was the land very fertile or strategically located. Some legends say that his mountains were full of precious rocks and minerals, but there is no archaeological correlate to verify this. So, was it just an act of ruthless dominion by the great three to prove their military might? Kapilar takes a dig at the Moovendar in one of the Puram poems that goes, Kadandadudane Moovirum Kudi Udandranir Ayinum Parambu Kolarku Aride. Even if the great three with their murderous armies unite, Parambu Nadu will be very difficult to seize. முன்னூறு ஊர்த்தே தன் பரம்பு நல்நாடு முன்னூறு ஊரும் பரிசிலர் பெற்றனர் யாமும் பாரியும் உளமே குன்றும் உண்டு நீர் பாடினீர் செலினே. There are 300 villages in the fine cool Parambu Nadu, and Pari gifted away all of them to those who came asking. So if you go now singing with humbleness, you can win what remains, namely myself, Pari and his mountain. Kapilar's verses that Pari gifted away all the 300 villages that formed his territory to the bards may be an exaggeration, but it captures the extreme generosity of Pari. Thus, Kapilar taunts the great three, saying that the only way they could win over Pari's land is by going to him and singing like the humble bards. Interestingly, this and two other Puram poems sung by Kapilar all fall under the subdivision that is the Thurai that sets the theme Mahal Maruthal. Now, we have seen about another subdivision known as Mahatpar Kanji in a few poems before. One of the Thurais in the Tolgapiyam that is defined as a clan refusing to give their daughter in marriage to a sovereign king who demands it. There are about 20 poems in the Purananuru that fall in this subdivision, and some of them record of how a sovereign king either went and laid siege to or declared war on the land of a clan. The subdivision Mahan Maruthal or Mahan Mori Maruthal is something similar and refers to a theme describing the refusal of a chieftain to give his daughter's hand in marriage when demanded by a hostile warrior. The Purapurul Venba Malai, a later work, defines this Thurai. Could it be that in a last-ditch attempt to seize Parambu Nadu, the great three sent emissaries to Pari demanding his daughter's hands in marriage? As the Thurai defines, Pari must have refused, as it would have been very clear that the marriage proposals were nothing but a barter for his land. Their egos bruised, could this have been the reason the Moovendar lay siege to Pari's lands, a conjuncture arising out of the specific Thurai under which Kapilar has penned his poems? While recording the treacherous intentions of the great three, Kapilar ridicules them in yet another Puram poem which falls under the same Thurai, Mahan Maruthal. Adido Dane Pariyadu Parambe Nadikol Murasin Moovirum Muttinum உழுவர் உழாதன நான்கு பயன் உடைத்தே begins the poem. Pari's Parambu is a pitiable place. Even if the three of you with your royal drums surround it, it will flourish. There are 4 crops that grow there without ploughing and planting by farmers. The bamboo that yields bamboo rice, the jackfruit trees that are a plenty, the vallikodi which gives the yam tuber, and plenty of honey that flows down the mountains. So Parambu will survive. ஆங்கு மரந்தோறும் பிணித்த களிற்றினராயினும் புலந்தோறும் பரப்பிய தேரினராயினும் தாளின் கொள்ளலீர் வாளின் தாரலன். Even if your elephants that are so many in number could be tied one to each tree in Pari's dense forests, and even if you spread your chariots all over the land surrounding his Parambu mountain, you will not win anything with your efforts, and he will not yield to your swords. Yan arihuven adu kollum are. I know the way to seize his country. if you tune the polished twisted strings of your small yar, that is lute, and go to him dancing and singing, followed by the viralier, the beautiful dancing ladies, and seek alms from him, he will give you both his country and his mountain. Pari remained undefeated for a long period of time, probably because of the challenges that his mountainous terrain gave, making it very difficult for large armies to approach. Eventually, the Moovendar joined forces and laid siege to the Parambu hills, and this siege seemed to have lasted for years. This is recorded in an Ahananuru poem by yet another famed poet Nakirar, who came a little later. While comparing the beauty of Parambu Nadu to a heroine, Nakirar sings, "உலகுடன் திரிதரும் பலர்புகழ் நல்லிசை வாய்மொழி கபிழன் சூழ செய் நின்று செழுஞ்செய் நெல்லின் விழை கதிர்கொண்டு தடந்தாள் ஆம்பல் மலரொடு கூட்டி யாண்டு பல கழிய வேண்டுவயிர் பிழையா." Her forehead is like the honey-fragrant new flowers from the fresh springs of generous Pari, who owned fast horses, who did not deviate from desirous principles, even when his land lay under siege for many years. Yandu pala kaliya vendu vayir pilaya. He and his friend, the honest poet Kapilar, lived on mature grains collected and brought by trained birds from distant lands. The generous Pari, who was once victorious and chased the enemy kings away. Alas, Pari could not last through the siege, and though Kapilar renders several poems after the passing away of Pari, there is nothing in his poems that clearly tell us how the enemies actually captured the Parambu hills or how Pari actually met his death. Now, some scholars opine that Pari killed himself with his sword, that he chose to die rather than to surrender to the Moovendar, the mystery adding to his enigma. Well, eventually, Parambu Nadu was conquered and Pari lost his life, and upon his death, his daughters have rendered a heart-wrenching poem in the Puram works. Attrai tingal avvenilavin, endayum udayem kundrum pirar kolar. Ittrai tingal ivvenilavin, வென்ற எரி முரசின் வேந்தரெம் குன்றும் கொண்டார் யாம் எந்தையும் இளமே. Last month, under that white moon, we had our father and nobody had seized our mountains. But this month, under the same white moon, the kings with victory drums have seized our mountains, and alas, our father is no longer with us. Well, the English version of the poem can in no way capture the pathos in the Tamil verses. The young girls were taken into Kapilar's custody, and I would like to think that Kapilar himself rendered this poem, as it is a bit hard to believe that the girls would have been capable of rendering such exquisite verses, and the style of poetry too is very similar to Kapilar's. Kapilar describes how Parambu Nadu fell into despair, lost all its glory and natural wealth in quite a few poems. In the Puram poem 118, he sings, "Arayum porayum manandadalaya, என்னாள் திங்கள் அணைய கொடுங்கரை தென்னீர் சிறுகுளம் கீழ்வது மாதோ கூர்வேல் குவைய மொயம்பின் தேர்வன் பாரி தன் பரம்பு நாடே." The small lake with its clear water and its curved shoreline like the eighth-day moon, filled with boulders and knolls lying next to each other, is shattered now in the cool Parambu country that once belonged to Tervan Pari, who donated numerous chariots. The poem shows of how boulders were used to create bunds and small water bodies in the mountainous regions to capture rainwater, which was their only source. And these water bodies were guarded day and night. Now, with their ruler gone, the water body lay damaged. And seeing this, Kapilar asks, is this a sign of things to come? Parambu Nadu would be ruined, he laments. Most pathetic are the poems that show how Kapilar took Pari's daughters with him and went in search of a suitable groom. He sings to the Parambu hills as he takes leave, "Mattuvai thirappavum, maividai வீழ்ப்பவும், அட்டு ஆன்று ஆனா கொழுந்துவை ஊன்சோறும், பெட்டாங்கு ஈயும் பெருவழம் பழுனி." O Parambu mountain of great fame, in the past wine jars were opened, male sheep were slaughtered, Unlimited rice and fatty meat was served to all those who came in need. Great wealth was bestowed according to the desire of the receivers, and you made me your friend. Now Pari is dead. I'm confused and helpless. I'm leaving in search of husbands for his daughters. O great Parambu, I worship and praise you. Protect us. Kapilar first takes them to Vichiko, the ruler of Vichimalai, and he sings, Virangamani Kodumpoon Vichikove, Ivare Pootalai Ara a Punaigodi Mullai, நாத்தழும்பு இருப்ப பாடாது ஆயினும் கரங்குமணி நெடுந்தேர் கொள்க எனக் கொடுத்த பரந்து ஓங்கு சிறப்பின் பாரி மகளிர். O King Vichiko, wearing curved ornaments with gems and victorious in battle, these young women are the daughters of Pari, whose great fame is widespread. He gave a tall chariot with chiming bells to a jasmine creeper adorned with flowers so it might climb, even though the vine had never sung his praise. It is in these verses that we know of the legendary story of Pari giving his golden chariot to a mullai kodi, a jasmine vine creeper, for the first time. Yane parisilan mannum andanan. I am a Brahmin who has come to you asking for a gift. Ninakku yaan koduppa konmadi sinappor adanga mannare adakkum madanga vilayul naadu kilavoye. O King who overcomes belligerent enemies in harsh battles, O ruler of a country where harvests never fail, please accept these daughters of Pari in marriage. Well, Vichiko refused, obviously fearing the retribution of the great three, and so Kapilar approaches another powerful chieftain, Irungovel, and here he sings, இவர் யார் என்குவை ஆயின் இவரே ஊருடன் இரவலர்க்கு அருளி தேருடன் முல்லைக்கு ஈத்த செல்லா நல்லிசை படுமணி யானை பரம்பின் கோமான் நெடுமா பாரி மகளிர். Let me tell you who they are. They are his daughters, he who granted towns to those who came in need and earned great fame for gifting a chariot to a jasmine vine to climb. He who owned elephants with jingling bells, the lord of Parambu, the great king Pari. Yane Tandai Thoran, Ivar en Mahalir, Andanan Pulavan Kondu Vandanane. As for me, I am their father's friend, a Brahmin and a poet. Now they are my daughters, and I have brought him here. O Pulikkadimal, wearing a thick garland, who knows what a man's responsibility is and what your duty is towards bards, I am offering them, please accept them. When King Irungovel too refuses to marry Pari's daughters, Kapilar actually renders another poem reprimanding him and showing his frustration. Kapilar thereafter seems to have given up, and in the Puram poem 236 he sings, Malaikelu Nada Mavan Pari, கலந்த கேண்மைக்கு ஒவ்வாய் நீயர் புலந்தனை ஆகுவை புரந்த யாண்டே. O Lord of the mountains, O generous Pari, not fitting our close friendship and the many years that you have cared for me, you didn't allow me to go with you. You bade me to stay here. You must have hated me. May I be with you in the next life, just as in this. May the great destiny grant me this privilege. இம்மை போல காட்டி உம்மை இடையில் காட்சி நின்னோடு உடன் உறைவு ஆக்குக உயர்ந்த பாலே. Many a twist in the tale happens after this. Early redactors concluded that, so singing, Kapilar either handed over Pari's daughters to the Brahmins or got them married to a couple of Brahmins and then ended his own life by fasting until death. வடக்கிருந்து உயிர் நீத்தல். How did the early redactors come to this conclusion? We do not know. What we do know is that Kapilar was a very famed poet, and he was eulogized by several Sangam poets, including the contemporary poet Marokathu Nappasalayar, whose poem we have seen in an earlier episode. So if Kapilar had actually fasted until death and taken his life, then any one of these poets would have definitely mentioned this valiant act in one of the Sangam poems. Well, as far as my research goes, the earliest mention of Kapilar taking his life is found an inscription from the 10th century found in the Veerataneshwarar temple in Kallakurichi on the banks of the river Tenpennai in the Tirukkovilur taluk. An inscription created during the reign of Rajaraja Chola, it mentions that his mother Vanavan Madevi belonged to the Malayar clan and that Veerataneshwarar was their family deity. Well, remember we have seen that Malayman Kari's territory fell within the Tirukkovilur taluk. The inscription continues that Kapilar got Pari's daughters married to a descendant of the Malayar clan and then gave up his life. How? By jumping into a sacrificial fire. It also records that Kapilar died at Kapilakal, meaning Kapilar rock. Now, near this Veerataneshwarar temple, there is a very small hillock with an old Shiva temple atop. Now, this temple itself has been dated to the 14th and 15th century Common Era by the Archaeological Survey of India. But somewhere along the lines, this poor hillock got connected to an earlier version of Kapilar's story, and it was made to be out the spot where Kapilar sat and gave up his life. The hillock that was earlier known as Idaichi Kundru now got renamed as Kapilar Kundru. When and by whom there is no way of knowing, and today the hillock itself is under the protection of the ASI. It is unscrupulous how such legends were created and then recorded in inscription, giving it a kind of authenticity. Biggest disservice rendered by the medieval kings who recorded such hearsay on copper plates and rock inscriptions. Now, nowhere in the 17 poems that Kapilar rendered on Pari and Parambu hills has he mentioned the name of Pari's daughters. Again, it is in the individual works known as Thanipadal Thirattu that come in the 9th and 10th century Common Eras that these names as Angavai and Sangavai are mentioned for the first time, and new stories emerge about their marriage. Avvaiyar, the famed poetess, is brought into the story in a work known as the Pennai Nadi Puranam, of how one day Avvaiyar came drenched in the rain and the Pari Mahalir, who now went by the name Angavai and Sangavai, beautiful Tamil names nevertheless, gave her a blue silk cloth, and seeing the fine quality of the silk cloth, Avvaiyar enquires who they were and comes to know that they were the daughters of the great Vel Pari, and the story goes that she had them married to a descendant of the Malayar clan at Tirukkovilur, a king by the name Malayaman Devihan. In another work called Annamalayar Sadaham, the story goes that the Lord Vinayaga himself wrote the Tirumana Volai, that is the wedding invite, and that the wedding invitation was sent out to the Moovendar and they were invited to the wedding. Incredulous indeed the way legends grow. While history shows that Pari indeed was the most generous and valiant chieftain of an ancient Vedir clan who fell to the treacherous greed of the Moovendar, a greed that eventually led to the destruction of the Moovendars themselves. We will continue with the history of yet another Sangam chieftain in the next episode. Vanakkam.